Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Awaken Your Souls Journey podcast. I'm Angela, and I'm so happy that you could join us today because I have Phyllis Leavitt with me. And Phyllis has developed a unique take on how spiritual development and psychological healing go together in ways not often thought or written about. From years of experience healing from childhood trauma herself, and both inner child work and meditation practices, and well over 30 years experience as a psychotherapist, she feels a deep calling to share all she has learned with the public and demonstrate how the principles of the best psychotherapy and inner development can be used to help heal our country of escalating hatred, divisiveness, and violence. Thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. These are topics that I'm worked on all my life and feel passionate about. So I really welcome the opportunity to talk with you.
Yeah. And, now is a great time to talk about this. A lot of people are afraid right now about what's happening and are not sure what to do with all of that. And so I think it's a great time for us to talk about your book and all that you've learned over the past 30 some years. Yeah, we'll dive right into that. So tell us first just a little bit about yourself and how you managed to get into this work.
Yeah, the long story, hopefully kind of short, is I had a lot of childhood trauma that I had buried, like totally did not remember. And I think it was child sexual abuse at an early age. And I think it was just so traumatic that my psyche buried it. And what I was left with was just a feeling of I don't belong anywhere. There's something intrinsically wrong with me. I'm not lovable. And that colored my entire growing up years. And I managed to function, went to school. I was a really good student. I think I poured myself into my left brain. I loved learning. And interestingly enough, my path was both psychological and spiritual from the very beginning. I had very profound experiences periodically, brief, but very profound experiences of like just being held in divine love. And they were different. Sometimes I had that in nature. Sometimes I had that when I wrote, occasional, not very often, but enough for that it really cemented in me a longing for that kind of connection. And so I had these two parallel paths going all my life of like really dealing with myself on a psychological level, which I didn't know how to do, and having these periodic awakenings. And when I was in my 30s, it all kind of came crashing down. I was married, I had 3 children, and I was just at the lowest point in my life. And I went to therapy at that point. I had been in a spiritual group, I was doing spiritual practice. And what was happening for me, and I don't know that this is everyone's experience, but what happened for me really kind of set the blueprint for what I have worked on the rest of my life. So I went to therapy when I was doing a spiritual practice because it wasn't getting to the root of what this really undiagnosed pain was inside myself. I started to remember what happened to me. And then I had the most massive spiritual awakening right in the middle of processing very, very traumatic memories. And I had a divine voice that began talking to me as I wrote in my journal and told me all about what my soul was doing here and, how to work with my chakras. And I was taught meditations. And I developed this practice and this understanding from within myself rather than from an external source. The interesting part about all of that is so the worlds of psychology and spirituality came together. It was part of my psychological healing, which was unearthing these memories and bringing them to consciousness, that also unearthed and brought to consciousness my most divine connection to myself. And so that's a nutshell beginning.
And you don't hear this often, about the psychological processes and the spiritual process. working together. And I think that's
Right.
beautiful. I think it's amazing how you were able to come through this that way and now have all of this experience.
Yeah, and the other piece that I forgot to mention right there is another way that they really came together profoundly for me was that every experience I had of light, of this divine voice speaking to me and telling me what my soul was doing in some of these very difficult and painful experiences that I was having, was that spirit actually lit up the psychological work that I needed to do, what I needed to heal. And so a good example of that was I had always written from a very young age. I wrote poetry, I wrote these little pieces, but I kept them all to myself. But it was a way of connecting to my essence in a very, very profound way. What happened for me was every time I had a moment of light, I saw more about what I needed to do. And one of the examples that I was going to give was I needed to open my throat and actually speak in the world, and not keep it all to myself. And that's what actually being in therapy was the beginning in some ways of doing that, of like getting this out of my system verbally, talking about it, talking about my feelings, processing my feelings, getting feedback. So the work, I don't know if that was a good way of explaining it,
Yeah.
but Spirit actually told me what the work was I needed to do on the ground in my ordinary life. I needed to have my voice. I needed to believe my own truths. Because, like many people who have survived childhood trauma, I had so much doubt around my memories. They seemed so fantastical given the kind of ordinary, kind of quote unquote middle class life that I had grown up in. And yet I know as a psychotherapist, and I became a psychotherapist out of the work that I did, how much can happen behind closed doors in people's homes that you would never guess.
And I can see when those memories come up that you might doubt or question that. Go
Well, I
ahead.
was just going to say, being out there the way I am right now, as I was retrieving these memories from what happened to me early in life, and I was in this process of really getting divine guidance, I started to see past lives that were very much related. And what I began to understand, and what I was told very directly, was that the issues that our inner child carries and that we're healing in this life are part of a pattern of energies and issues that we've worked with through many, many, many lifetimes. And so past life work, and it's not for everyone. I had absolutely no interest in past lives. I didn't believe in past lives, or I shouldn't say I didn't believe in them, but I didn't believe you could actually retrieve them. And I wasn't interested in anybody telling me what my past lives were. But then all of a sudden, I began to see them and feel them viscerally in my body. And I could see that I had lifetimes of being silenced. So I had this enormous block in my throat. And that's what my work was in the world, was to open my throat and speak and connect and nurture myself and communicate. And that actually cleared the debris out of my life. Like that was, I understood my path for the very first time. So those two worlds came intimately together in the most healing and profound way, where I was working psychologically on the wounds that I had received in this life and that obviously carried some history from past lives, but also on listening to divine guidance of what to do with those things, seeing what happened to me in my life as a teacher rather than as bad karma or punishment or a sign that I was less than.
Yeah. I love how you explain about how the past lives have really helped you understand better what you are here to learn in this lifetime. I think that's really profound. And I know a lot of people have gone ahead and got past life readings. And, I've been curious, but never really sure how that might help me, but I can see that now. That's really interesting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really helped me a lot because I could see some of the emotions that I had. So one of the things that came up for me right away when I started this kind of divine download was I kept hearing in my head, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? Sin of pride were actually the words that came into my head. And that triggered this past life memory of a life in which I had had a very strong spiritual connection to Jesus and was killed because I had spoken out about it and was seen as a heretic. Um, and since then, since talking about that, I've met other people who have had similar past life experiences. But in any case, that added a dimension to my fear of speaking out that explained it to me. Why was I so afraid of having my voice? Why was I so afraid of even saying anywhere in the world, and I didn't for a while, that I was having this divine connection and actually hearing these messages come through me, because I felt like I was going to be killed. And
Right.
once I understood where that came from, I could work with it. And I knew that I wasn't going to be killed in this life and I could speak in this life. But I had to actually work with that fear.
Yeah. And I understand that to a point, because one of the things that I had a huge fear about was water. And it
Mm,
seemed like irrational, because
yeah,
I went to Bali and they were dumping water over my head. They do the Malakats there. And I was so afraid of that. I just felt like I was going to drown, and I would lay awake at night worried about the next day and or
right.
3 days ahead that I had to go do this. And it seemed so irrational because I went to swimming lessons. I took swimming, but somehow that was a huge trigger for my fear.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
working with an energy healer afterwards, she just said to me, you had some of these past lives were maybe Atlantis or something along that line. And she said, you've got this fear, you've drowned, you've, and through that retreat, I was able to alleviate that fear, which is
Wow.
totally
Wow.
amazing. And I was able to go snorkeling afterwards. And so in a way, I understand what you are talking about, how that knowledge can kind of give you a little bit of maybe confirmation that you're not just making that up. you know,
Right. That
yeah.
you're not crazy,
Mhm.
because so much information, this is one of the things that I'm so grateful for in my experience over so many years, is that information can come through other ways of consciousness and awareness than our conscious mind, or what we've learned, or what we've been told, or what been conditioned to look for and value. And I had such a profound experience of information coming to me in a way that I did not grow up ever hearing about and would have thought was crazy, and actually did in the beginning, except what I received was so loving and so wise and so non-judgmental and so profound that there was no way to deny it. It was changing my life.
Mhm. Yeah. That's so amazing. Wonderful. So now you're doing this work. What do you think would really help us right now in this time when we're living in this fear and worried about what's coming?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and here's where I think the intersection of psychology and spirituality can be so valuable for people, because basically, from our wounds, at least this was my experience, and this was certainly my experience as a psychotherapist for so many years, the ways that we're wounded generally, if we haven't had a chance to heal, generally put some kind of block or damper on our fullest self-expression, on us really being our strengths and our gifts in the world and feeling good about that and feeling in our integrity in relationship. Because I think for me anyway, I can say, and for all the people that I've worked with, when you're living out of your wounded state, which is no fault of your own, we tend to just be either protective or aggressive or depressed or people pleasing. We find some way to cope that doesn't necessarily serve our highest good, because we're basically in survival no matter what we've adapted. And these are all psychological issues, that we're in survival. And I think it's important to know. So going to therapy, if it's at all possible, or any kind of healing modality, to really address that early wounding or conditioning, even if you don't call it wounding in yourself, really helps open up your full potential. And I've never seen it not happen that when someone has a chance to do that, that they don't become more loving, more kind, more cooperative, more generous with other people, more able to be relational in a healthy way. And so that healing, on whatever level a person is able to do that, sometimes it's just through your art or nature or loving, your children. But often it requires a little bit more of a way to address what that early conditioning is that has been so imprinted on the way that we see the world and ourselves. And for many people, when they do that healing, and this was so true for me as I shared with you, it opens up a connection to their essential self, and what I call my soul, what other people call their essential self, or their essence, or their spirit, or the divine, or whatever. And so those two worlds can be really interrelated, or sometimes it starts with a spiritual connection, and that opens up a healing process, as it also did for me. I kind of followed both paths. So what I would say is, in these times when it seems like the forces that are in control of so many of us are much bigger than any one person could address, what's really important is not to feel powerless. And, one of the things that I learned in my own life, and really learned this from being a therapist, working with hundreds of people over the years, many of whom had very extensive trauma in their childhoods also, is that in addition to the ways that I mentioned, and there's other ones where we tend to find a way to cope in the world, people tend to follow two paths when they've been hurt and they have not had a chance to heal. And those two constructions are either they become very passive and helpless because they've been so overpowered and they've been rendered helpless, and staying helpless is actually a survival mechanism, or they identify with the aggressor and become somewhat like the aggressor and tend to act out on other people and look for positions of power and control so that they can have someone to dominate. And then those of us who, and I was more like the type that became helpless, we kind of attracted to each other. The person who's dominating looks for people they can dominate, and the people who have become more powerless as a response to unhealed trauma tend to be subject to people who will dominate them or reward them for following them. And we see this playing out in our culture, in our country, in the United States. We see this playing out massively here, and it's a very dangerous collective psychological situation where you have more and more people who have been conditioned to be over controlled, and more people who want to control. And then some of those people who have identified with the aggressor become, powerful. They seek positions of power, and they have the power to dominate many people out of their wounding. And so what I have really come to do is that our psychology, our unhealed state, is the big missing piece in politics today. And my current book is called America in Therapy, A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis, in which I really bring that message. How can we understand ourselves collectively through a psychological lens? How have we been hurt individually, as groups, as genders, as economic groups, as political parties, as a government and businesses? How can we understand those dynamics through a psychological lens and begin to heal them so that we begin to treat each other the way that we want to be treated and not act out our unconscious wounds on each other? And I've seen this happen in spiritual groups. I've seen it happen in schools. I've seen it happen in businesses. I've seen it happen in any group, because that's what we do. We do what we know, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense. Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
in answer to your question, one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves and everyone in the world is to heal our own wounds. Whatever route you take, whether it's a spiritual meditative practice or psychological healing, or both, or you pursue what you love in life, your art, your love of animals, music, improving your relationships, whatever one person does, I really believe can have a ripple effect. And it's so important for the man on the street, and I consider myself the man on the street, to feel like we're not powerless, because that's what actually someone who's in a position of aggression and domination wants. They want they want other people to feel powerless so that they can continue their domination. And so it's very important to know that what you do, what I do, what the man next to me does, what the clerk behind the register does, all contributes either to our welfare or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that message about how we aren't powerless. We think
Right.
we are, but those simple acts of self care and kindness to others are huge. And we maybe don't recognize the ripple effect of that and how powerful that really is. It's like you help one person, they help somebody else, and there's such magnitude in that. Even just in this simple podcast, somebody
That's
listening
right.
to this and hearing this and then taking initiative and saying, okay, I'm going to improve myself. I'm going to do some self care. I'm going to do some healing. And that's going to affect the collective in a really positive way.
I
Yeah.
totally agree with you. I totally agree with that. And I think so many times we think the energies of hate or violence or discrimination or withholding of resources, those negative energies, we think they're so powerful, and we forget that love is powerful and that inclusion is powerful, and uniting people and bringing them together in a shared cooperative venue is also powerful and can have a ripple effect. And one of the things that I've had to learn, and I think I'm still learning, because I didn't come into the work that I do with any kind of like a social media following. I wrote my books out of the guidance from my own inner self, that I just needed to have these voices in the world. I think it's one of the things that I'm learning and continuing to learn is we may never know the ripple effect, and that's okay. Like you said, one person affects one person, and they go on and maybe they do something different in their life that you'll never know. And so I think it's just really important to believe and to keep on believing in what your spirit is calling you to do, no matter what the results are. You might blow up on social media, and you might have 3 people who think your message was great, but that doesn't mean you should stop, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because every little bit is huge. And I think that's something that people don't realize. But hopefully, as we talk about it more and more, and as you look for it, that's the other thing.
Right.
When you start looking for it in the world, the kindness, and then you start to see it more. It's like me when I first started looking for grief information.
Mm,
I couldn't find
mm,
anything. I didn't know where it was. And now that
right.
I'm in that world and I've been looking at it, there's so much out there for so much help for people. But you have to be looking for it. You have to pursue it.
I totally believe that. I love that context. And I will also say that there are so many different kinds of loss. Some loss is you lost someone important to you, your mother or your father or your sibling died, or something, your family lost all their money and you had to live in poverty, or whatever it was. That loss can be as a formative factor in your life. And I know in my life, when I first started doing therapy, I grieved for the childhood I didn't have. And one of the blessings out of the work that I was fortunate enough to be able to do was that I could begin to see that as, okay, that's the raw material, that grief, that pain, that loss is the raw material that I am building my life out of now. And it has certainly taught me compassion over and over and over again for myself, and for which I can still be learning, and for other people, and to just know how hard this road can be, and sometimes how long it can take.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and it's true. I believe that the loss of my husband, as devastating as that
Mm,
was, and as much as I didn't like it and still don't,
right.
there's still so many positives that I can take from that. And like you say, it's almost like a fuel that propels you forward and
Yeah,
helps you start to search and find and figure out who you are and what you really want to do in life. And none of this would
totally.
have happened. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
And I think that actually what you just said is really, in some ways, the heart of psychological healing and spiritual healing, is that we make out of whatever our life is. It is what it is. It was what it was. Your husband died, which is a horrible tragedy. I was abused as a child, which is a horrible tragedy. And we have the opportunity to help each other make something out of that. One of the things that I did before I ever went to therapy, I just found myself attracted to reading books, autobiographies and biographies of people who had made something out of a tragedy in their life. And I think my spirit was just looking for that inspiration. And we can do that for each other.
Yeah. Still, telling your story is so powerful. And I know that from experience because I interviewed now 150 people that have
Right,
transformed their life through grief. And I've heard their
right.
stories, and there's been so many inspiring. Well, some people go through so much tragedy, and then they are still able to use that as
Right.
fuel and build a life that they love and live a fulfilling and joyful life
That's totally
despite.
right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And for me, what I see is I don't know how to change what's going on in the world. All I know is I have my one small part to play. And that's something that I just really want to share. We each have a valuable part to play. And I think if anything is going to change what's going on in the United States today, for example, and I know that what's going on in the United States is going on in many, many countries around this world, this move toward authoritarianism and high levels of discrimination and injustice that go along with the mindset of domination and forcing people to submit to your will. If there's anything that could really change it, I believe it's a grassroots movement. And I don't necessarily mean organized right now, but the more people who heal themselves and feel that they can make a contribution. My contribution is in the world of spirituality and psychology, and I had to heal all the blocks in my throat to be able to even write the books that I wrote. And I'm not saying they're all healed. I'll be in a healing process for the rest of my life because there's more and more that I want to say that I've been afraid to say. But we each have something, whatever it is, we each have some very valuable contribution. And I think the more we support one another to be our fullest selves, and that doesn't mean conform to anything, doesn't mean conform to a certain practice or a religion or a mindset, but just to be our fullest selves. Our fullest selves are a contribution to the whole. And I think that I call it a grassroots movement toward healing that we can all participate in and feel like we have some power in.
Yeah. I love that. And so you've written about this in your book. And so tell us more about your book.
Yeah, my book is called America in Therapy, A New Approach to Hope and Healing. And what I focused on in this book, and I have written two previous books that are more about the spiritual messages that I received. One is A Light in the Darkness, and the other is Into the Fire. America in Therapy really focuses on the psychological healing and the principles that I learned both through my own healing journey and as being a psychotherapist for so many years. So I talk about very clearly with, a little bit about myself, a lot of case histories that are disguised about clients that I worked with, and just my professional takeaways and observations over the years of what happens to people when they're hurt by other people and they don't have a way to escape it and they don't have a chance to heal. What are all the symptoms? do we even know as a culture that when people are hurt, they don't just buck up and fly right? They're hurt, they're symptomatic, they're on survival. And I've mentioned a lot of the symptoms already: depression, anxiety, self-harm, addiction, people pleasing, workaholism. Even joining a fanatical group can be a symptom of unhealed psychological wounds, where a person is looking for where they might find some sense of power and belonging, but they don't have a healthy blueprint for doing that inside themselves. And so I talk about the symptoms of unhealed abuse and how they affect us on a collective level, which I mentioned. One of the things, which is we're producing more and more people who feel helpless and more people who have identified with the aggressor, which is very, very dangerous. And can we apply the best of what psychology has to offer to what I call the family of America, or it could be the family of an organization, it could be a family of origin, it could be a community. But can we take what we know heals and begin to consciously bring that into political conversation? Having people sit down and commit to nonviolent communication with a goal of actually understanding each other rather than othering, rather than feeding this partisan frenzy and ideological divide. What I'm saying in my book is that we're not really suffering ultimately from an ideological divide or partisan divide. The great partisan divide we have is a mental health issue. And why is that so? Because people who are mentally healthy want to work things out. They're committed to nonviolence. They want to restore their relationships to love and belonging and cooperation, if at all possible. And when it's not possible, and sometimes we don't know how to work things out, we can at least, from a healthy mental health point of view, agree to separate in peace. And that, just to bring that little bit that I just said to you into national conversation, would be a game changer. Mm-hmm. And then I talk about a lot of paradigm shifts. I've mentioned one of them here. How are we relating to power in our personal lives, in our families? Do we try to dominate to get our way? Is that the best way? Does that build relationship? Does it build intimacy? Or can we learn the model of sharing power with one another? Because that's what makes up a relatively healthy relationship. Whether it's between partners or a family or a business relationship, when we share power, when we really support people to be their best rather than compete with them and try to hold them down to put ourselves up, that changes the emotional climate. I'll just mention one more thing in my book. I have a whole chapter on what I call the 6 secrets of repairing relationship when there is conflict. And it all boils down to one thing, which is, instead of blaming you and focusing on what you have to do differently, and that doesn't mean I can't tell you what you're doing that isn't working for me, but instead of focusing on blame, I focus on how could I be different in this? How could I take responsibility to steer this whole conflict in a different direction? And I outline that really very specifically in that chapter, because those are the elements of taking personal responsibility rather than othering, which, again, you can see the national application. If we were really being responsible for our own behavior, if we were really listening to other people the way we want them to hear us, if we were valuing other people the way we want to be valued, if we were speaking the way we want to be heard, there'd be no more war. Honestly, there'd be no more war.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, this is very important work and very important discussion, I think, for people to hear. It certainly isn't something that I've heard a lot of discussion around, and yet I think very much needed. So thank you for taking the time. And do you have any parting words or advice before we go?
Well, I would love to turn people onto my website, which
Sure.
is my name, phyllisleavitt.com. And please, pick up any of my books, because I feel like I just want to share. I just want to share what I've learned that I think is helpful. And, the parting words that I would have are very much echoing what we've already talked about. We can all make a difference. And the bottom line thing that I've learned as a therapist and as a seeker and whatever is that we are wired for love and connection. And the injuries that cause the worst symptoms in people are when they have suffered harm in the realm of love and connection, love and safe connection. And so love and safe connection is what heals. And we can all be instruments of that healing for one another to the very best of our ability. And nobody's going to do it perfectly, but we can learn as we go. So that's my last message.
I love it. Thank you so much again for taking the time and for doing this. And yeah, I hope that people go to your website and to check out your books and see what they can do for themselves to help
Well,
everyone.
thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate talking to you. I know that you're full of insights of your own, and I look forward to following you. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for watching. And bye for now.